In electronic music, basslines can make or break your track, so if you struggle to produce great sounding basslines consistently and it's more like a hit or miss, then this video is exactly what you need. I'm going to show you 3 essential basslines that professional producers use all the time, and for a good reason, because they serve as a starting point for more complex stuff later down the line. If you don't know me yet, my name is Philip from Pick Yourself. I produce, mix and master music professionally for over 15 years. I do this full time, and I'm also a coach and mentor for artists like you who want to finish music consistently. I do this together with an awesome team of music professionals, all full-time as well. With that being said, if you want to find out more, check out the link in the description. Now let's get into the video. So the first bassline I'm about to show you is called the rolling bassline. It's an all-time classic in electronic music, and don't worry, if you're already advanced, I'm going to show you a few extra tips and tweaks that will make it worthwhile for you as well. So for this bassline, you typically use 16th notes in the key of your song, in the fundamental note of your key. So we are in G minor currently, so we can use G. Let's go for a little bit lower one. Then this is a 16th note. You can change the grid, obviously, and you basically just duplicate it to fill out the whole bar. Now, my tip for you is to not let these notes overlap, but actually keep a little bit of space. Yeah, so this will make it easier later on to separate the individual notes. Now for our sound design, we're going to use wavetable, so let's slap that on. So currently it sounds like this. Still a bit too high. I could change this on the synthesizer, but I could also just change it here on the MIDI notes. I'm a big fan of just changing stuff on the MIDI notes, so you always know what your kind of foundation sounds like. So 1 octave lower, it sounds like this. Now we obviously have to dial in the sound design so that we get an actual decent bass sound. So my sound design philosophy for bass is that I want the first oscillator to sound really stable and to give me already the foundation and the satisfying feel that we want from an electronic music track. So let's dial this in. Typically for bass sounds, you might want to use either sawtooth waves or square waves. The cool thing is with wavetable, you have these basic shapes already available here, and you can find the sweet spot that you personally like. I will choose something between the sawtooth and the square wave. Now you want this to sound a bit more plucky, so a bit more pronounced, because right now it's still like the notes are washed out a bit, and this is because you have to dial in the amp envelope accordingly. So amp envelope means you have the attack of the sound, you have the decay, the sustain, and the release. Yeah, these are the different points. Now if you bring down this here, so from the attack, you bring the decay down, you will get this more plucky sound. And then if you want the notes to actually end wherever the MIDI note is ending, so this MIDI note is ending a bit shorter here, you also want to bring down the release. This is super staccato now, and you have to use this dial here, so the decay time, to basically find the sweet spot. Where do you get enough bass sound still, but how do you still keep it staccato sounding and like really syncopated? So this is a good starting point. You don't have to dial this in perfect. And the cool thing is that later on, if you automate stuff in your track, you could, for example, automate the release time so that the bass notes start to wash out intentionally to add some interest to a part. So this is where great electronic music shines. This is these little automations and modulations that make it so worthwhile. Let's now make the filter a bit more interesting. I really like this OSR filter here. You can add a little bit of drive, which adds some nice saturation to the filter sound itself. What we want to do is we bring this down, give it a little bit of resonance, and then we map either the amp envelope or a different envelope to the filter frequency. Now, I first of all like to just use the original amp envelope and just see if it works. Very often this gives me already the satisfying feel that I want, and it's dialed in perfectly. Play around with different settings of the filter, so a bit steeper. Like this a bit more. Now, this is still one oscillator, one filter, super simple. Now, if you want to increase the level of complexity in your sound design, this is a great starting point to add in additional tweaks. For bass sound, I think we could use some sub sounds underneath. So this is like 1 octave lower. And with the tone setting, you're essentially giving it more overtones or less. Two octaves is a bit too low. Very nice, okay. And then let's add in a second oscillator. You don't necessarily have to do this every time. You could also just keep it simple. But I personally like to have a bit more complexity on top of my bass line. So what I will do is I will add a second oscillator here and then go for some of the more advanced shapes. This one is one that I really like especially for bass sounds. Because like I'm just showing you, you can create this slight phasing effect, which sounds quite cool. I like this a lot. If you want that movement to happen, you can just go here to the LFO and basically map one of these LFOs to the position of the wavetable. So here, oscillator 2 position, this is the position of the wavetable. If you place it somewhere in the middle and then you go to the LFO, we add a little bit here. Now it's sweeping through with every single MIDI note. If you want it to just meander around, you can deactivate the retrigger. So it's not retriggering with every single MIDI note, but it's just constantly wandering through the sound. Make it a bit slower, also maybe make the shape a bit softer. You could also do something like a slight detuning, for example, adding 7 semitones. And then obviously just feed a tiny bit of that in. You don't want all of that sound bleeding into your bass. Now, the issue with rolling bass lines is that very often they sound a bit too static, a little bit too lifeless and robotic. So it's always a good idea to add a little bit of life to those sounds. So here's a little pro tip for you. You can actually go into your MIDI notes, change the velocity on some of them, and use that change in velocity to change things in your sound design as well. Let me show you how this works. So I go into these MIDI notes and I just bring down, for example, the velocity of every first note. If you don't do this perfectly, but intentionally do it sloppy like I do right now, this actually creates a bit more interesting variation. Now you can then go into your sound design and on the modulation sources, you go to here to the MIDI notes, and this is by default mapped to the amp setting, which means the velocity is affecting how loud the output of the synthesizer is. This is what this basically means. The default setting is 50, you can bring this to 100, and then this accentuates it even more. So when we play this now, you created some kind of side chaining effect to the kick drum. So every time the kick drum hits on the first note, this is brought down. But what a lot of people don't know is that you can also map this velocity to a lot of other parameters, which makes it much more fun and interesting. For example, to the filter frequency, to the oscillator position. Let's check this out. So let's go to our oscillator position of the first oscillator, and then let's see what we can do here. Let's maybe use the velocity to trigger the change here. Now you see the oscillator shape is basically jumping up and down depending on the velocity levels that we set here. If you do this a bit more crazy and you go to the MIDI notes and randomize the velocity, now, sometimes you want a bit more stability and then you don't use the randomize function, but the capabilities for creative exploration are super cool. So let's go back to our more straightforward rolling bass line without all the crazy stuff. If you want to accentuate your kick drum hits a bit more, what you can do is you map the velocity negatively to the filter frequency. And so it ducks down the bass line even more. Normal. Super cool. Let's now go to the second type of bassline, which is by far my favorite bassline of all time in electronic music, and you will find out why. Before we get there, if you got any value out of this video so far, consider subscribing to the channel, consider liking this video. It helps me, but it also puts more great stuff into your feed. So you might have heard of the dotted eighth note bass already. What you have to do here in terms of MIDI notes is actually quite simple. Let's first of all delete what we have here. So I will make this super clear for you, even if you have zero idea of music theory. So what we see here is basically a whole bar. This is 1/4. This is an eighth note. And a dotted eighth is basically an eighth note with an added 16th note. So you see the grid is currently set to 16th notes. And we have 1, 2, 3 16th notes. This makes up a dotted eighth note. If you want to create a dotted eighth bass, what you do is you can basically just use this and duplicate it and populate the bar with these types of notes. So it's 1 dotted eighth, then the next one, then the next one. So this currently sounds like this. But this is just the beginning. So let's zoom out for a moment. We duplicate this, or basically we duplicate this a bit easier. So duplicate this again. And the more we zoom out, the better we can see what actually happens here. At some point, the sequence starts to repeat. So as you can see here, this is one bar, and this dotted eighth note still stretches into the next bar. Here, once again, it stretches into the next bar. But then here, you have this moment where it perfectly ends with the next bar. So what we can do is we get rid of this here, set the loop to end here. And this gives you this nice polyrhythmic feel. Now the music theory nerds will say this is not a polyrhythm, this is a polymeter, whatever. You get the idea, so it gives you this feel of something weird is happening here and it repeats after a certain time. Let's just listen to this so you know exactly what I mean. Super cool stuff. Now there's a couple of things you may want to dial in to make this actually sound great, because the sound design is being influenced by the MIDI notes, as we figured out earlier. What you can do is you select all of them and once again leave a little bit distance here and see if the syncopation gets a bit more accentuated. You can even go as far as zoom in and basically make these notes quite a bit shorter so that they're not dotted eighth anymore, but they still give you this rhythmic feel. So depending on your goals with the track, you might want to change this. Or you go into the sound design here. What happens if you, for example, go to the amp envelope and make this a bit more open? So once again, these are also things you can automate throughout the song. And my favorite way of using this dotted eighth rhythm goes like this. You basically keep the length of the notes more or less like this, and you start to leave out some of the notes. So you basically start empty. And then you also figure out where can I shoot other holes into this groove to make it sound interesting. You can play this game of duplicating this again and then basically surprising the listener by adding, for example, a weird change in here. So you have 1 dotted eighth here, but then here you leave it out, something like that. And even if we have a super standard groove with our drums, this type of bass line makes the whole experience worthwhile. And it's very, very engaging and groovy. By the way, if you struggle with finishing music consistently and you're not sure why that is, I have something that can help you. It's called the Finisher Framework. It's a completely free guide that you can use to finish at least one great sounding song per month if you implement that system. You get it at pickyourself.com/framework. It's completely free. You also find the link in the description. The third and final bass line I want to share with you today is so underused. I still can't believe that not more people know about this and more people implement this, because it sounds awesome. It's very unique. Maybe a bit quirky even, but we'll see. Let me duplicate this again, rename it. Now the reason this third bassline is called Triplet Bass is because we're dividing our bar differently than in the normal way. So normally you would have 4 quarter notes, yeah, so this is making up one bar, but you can actually switch to a so-called triplet grid. You can use option 3 to switch to this. And now this is divided differently. So if we lock these notes to the triplet grid, it's going to look a bit different. And you can still make up the whole bar with these triplets. What's cool about this is that we can also switch to a 8th note triplet grid, and this gives us a very similar feel to the rolling bass line, but it's still different. Now you might be thinking, well, that sounds weird. There's no electronic music that I know of that uses a triplet bass line. Well, think again. There's, for example, a track like A New Era by Moderat. One of the all-time hits of that band is consisting of this as the essence of their track. What I like about triplets is that they allow you to go beyond a typical groove. So what is actually quite nice is if you create a combination of straight and triplet grooves. So we take our triplet loop, we duplicate this so that it's actually longer. Let me delete a couple of those here from the first section, and we'll play around with our dotted 8th groove that we've created before. Check this out. Another cool way to use triplets is to create tension in the part and basically harmonize the whole song interestingly. So we can do something a bit dramatic, for example, or energetic. And if you combine everything you've learned in those 3 different essential bass lines, you can end up with a bass line that is very complex but still relies on those fundamentals. Artists like Disclosure, for example, they would write bass lines that sound super complex, but in the end they consist of the same building blocks. Something like this. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you still struggle with sound design, here's a video that might help.